Welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight. I am honored and blessed to welcome you for tonight's program, but first, I would like to wish our veterans in the crowd. I ask you if you would be willing to please stand so we can give our veterans a round of applause. Thank you. I would also ask the loved ones of those who serve to please stand so we can give them a round of applause for their support and what they did while their significant other was serving. So please, the loved ones, would you please stand up? This year marks the 20th anniversary of the attacks on September 11, 2001. And I'm sure all of you, well, except for a few kids here that I see that have made it, some Edgar fifth graders, yay for them. They're looking for extra credit and some candy tomorrow, which they'll get. But I'm sure you all remember. You remember what you were doing, who you were with, where you were, what you were wearing, and even some of the most minute, smallest details on that day. I remember where I was. I was in Thailand, and today when I shared that story with our Edgar middle school and high school students, it was crazy to think that none of them in the audience were of age to have been alive at that time. Which gets to our purpose. In school, we push, what is the why? Why are we doing things? Why are we learning this? Why are we reading that? This is our why. To have experts, to have people who were there, firsthand accounts, to stand, to sit, to share their stories with our students, our youth. That is our why. We can read in the textbooks. We can read wonderful books like Doug Stanton has written. We can watch movies that his books have been made into, like 12 Strong or the USS Indianapolis. But we need people like Mark to fill in the blanks or to answer intriguing questions. So our why is to have these opportunities. So as I told them, we are here to celebrate our heroes, just like we did shortly ago. And it is important that even you as veterans in our crowd, that you share your story. It might not be written in a book like Doug's, but it needs to be heard, it needs to be known, it needs to be remembered by everybody, because we are proud of you. And we are proud to acknowledge not only today on Veterans Day, but every day to thank you for your service. And as I said before, we are blessed this Veterans Day to have two amazing people on stage with us. We have author Doug Stanton, who is a New York Times best-selling author. Some of you might have remembered when we had Dick Thielen, a survivor of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, here, and we featured the story In Harm's Way. If you were here, I sure hope you brought that book so you could have Doug sign it. Doug also has a book about Vietnam titled The Odyssey of Echo Company. But tonight we are here to feature his book, Horse Soldiers, which was made into the movie, like I said before, 12 Strong. Horse Soldiers spent nearly 3 consecutive months at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and was named a notable book. The U.S. Army Special Forces at John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and school selected the book as required reading. Doug has appeared on national TV and radio outlets and has been covered in many prominent publications. He has also written on travel, sport, and entertainment, during which time he got mugged by jungle revolutionaries We'll have to maybe ask later about that. He played basketball with George Clooney, and he took an acting lesson from a gracious Harrison Ford. Doug, with his wife, Ann, who is a reporter and editor, have devoted to volunteering with public service around issues of arts, education, and literacy. His work, his family, and himself have received numerous awards and recognition. Doug and Ann live in Michigan with their 3 children, John, Catherine, and Will, where they co-founded the Grant Pearsons, the National Writers Series, a year-round book festival featuring great conversations with America's best storytellers and Front Street writers, a writing workshop and scholarship program for high school students. Mark Mitchell is a former senior executive in DOD who served most recently as the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. He is also highly decorated U.S. Army Infantry and Special Forces combat veteran who served 28 years on active duty. He participated in multiple combat tours in the First Gulf War, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In recognition of his actions during the Battle of Kuala Jangi in November 2001, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, our nation's second highest decoration for valor in combat. He served and commended at almost every level throughout his service. His final assignment in uniform was on the National Security Council as a director for counterterrorism. In this assignment, he was intimately involved in significant hostage cases and recovery efforts in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia. He was instrumental in establishing the framework for the landmark Presidential Policy Review of Hostage Policy, which resulted in significant changes in organization and policy for hostage recovery. Following his retirement from active duty, Mark worked as a business executive in the private sector. Mark holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biomedical engineering from Marquette University and a Master of Science degree in defense analysis from the Naval Postgraduate School. He is also a board member and an advisor to several nonprofit organizations dedicated to serving veterans and their families, including Warriors Ethos, Gold Star Teen Adventures, the Global SOF Foundation, and Special Operations Survivors. He is now a small business owner in the travel industry as an Expedia Cruise franchisee. He is married to Mary Ann, who is formerly of Montgomery, Alabama, and they live with their 2 daughters, Caroline, who is a recent graduate of the United States Military Academy and is now on active duty as a military intelligence officer, and Margaret, a senior at the University of St. Andrews. Please join me in giving our guests a warmer Wisconsin welcome than outside.
I think a little better on my feet, so I'm just going to stand here for a minute. Mark is the one who's quick on his feet, as we're going to talk about tonight when it comes to being in rapidly changing and highly dangerous environments. He's incredibly humble, and I'm up here to bring some highlights to tonight's talk that otherwise might not come out. That is, I've written 3 books about combat. Horse Soldiers is, I think, perhaps the most interesting, the most complicated, and perhaps ironically, Mark, and we can talk about this towards the end of our evening tonight when we'll have times for questions, the least understood. We understand what happened in World War II. We had a very symmetrical battle. We took ground and we achieved victory. In Vietnam, however, I must add, of course, that is tricky as well. And how many Vietnam veterans do we have here in the audience tonight? All right, well, welcome. I'm glad you're here. I had an amazing journey writing about that conflict, that war as well. We might talk about that towards the end of the evening. In terms of what Horse Soldiers is like, on this Veterans Day, 20 years after 9/11, it's really more like World War II, and I want to set the stage before Mark and I sit down here and talk between ourselves, in that this gentleman and about, let's say, 49 others from the United States Army and other services were dropped behind enemy lines in October, and Mark went in November of 2001, just weeks after 9/11, without any real promise of quick rescue, without any real promise of easy or quick success. In fact, what they had set out, what they were told to do or hoped to do might take a year. I'll jump ahead and say it took about 6 weeks. They faced an enemy that far outnumbered them, say 60,000 to 50 in the first weeks. That enemy was the Taliban and other transnational fighters who'd used Afghanistan as bases or as a base to train for the 9/11 attacks. It might just help us for a moment to remember why we went there. Mark has a really interesting slide here, which he'll show, and you'll see a prominent detail on that slide is no longer in our life, and there it is, the World Trade Center. And there is Mark on the far left with his troop, and I'll let him explain that as we go. But we went there quick. Do you remember what that was like? It happened. It was on television. In some ways, it was like the Vietnam War, in that it was televised and happening in real time. And there was no way in the world, in this high-speed, internet-connected sense that we want things to happen now, that the American tempo was going to allow for a 60,000 troop deployment through another country into a place like Afghanistan. So, if you went to the Pentagon, where Mark ended up working, and looked under the A's for Afghanistan, there was no plan. I mean, there was no plan. No plan. He said, pick up the mic, you can jump in too. And so he gets the call. He and several other teams at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 5th Group Special Forces. And to end my preamble here, to bring it back to World War II, is guys, your job is to go in behind Taliban lines, to work with otherwise disparate groups, such as we might have in this room tonight, an ethnic group here, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and the Uzbeks over there. You're all fighting amongst yourselves since the Soviets withdrew. And I know we have someone named Andrew in here who's from Ukraine and is quite familiar with the Soviet enterprise in Afghanistan. Maybe during the Q&A he will speak. Mark and his colleagues get all of us in this room to stop fighting each other and turn in one direction and head directly at the Taliban. And that is how, in 6 weeks, 2 months, let's just say a year, jump ahead, they had achieved their mission, which was to make Afghanistan unsafe for Al-Qaeda and to crush the Taliban command and control element. That was it. That was victory. For those of you in the audience who just perhaps weren't in the military, though, that's like saying, we want you to go and achieve the impossible. Just go do it, and don't go too far this way and too far that way. It's very unusual in the Army to have that kind of freedom. And that freedom was instilled or bestowed on Mark and colleagues because of what we call the Special Forces soldier, who is trained to think in highly adaptive, cross-trained manner. I'll leave with one anecdote which led me to write this book, and which I hope we can get to tonight to display the specialness of this kind of warfighting, which is not about necessarily breaking things and blowing things up. It's about conflict resolution. It's about building relationships. And there were 2 anecdotes, actually. One, I heard about one Special Forces major or colonel who dined out on the fact that in Central America, where he was stationed or deployed, he walked into a guerrilla camp which had been attacking his own men unarmed, convinced them to drive him up the hill to their guerrilla leaders' headquarters, and convinced them all to lay down their arms and stop fighting him. Unarmed, but he was armed with language skills, cultural awareness, and an extreme awareness of the relationships in this room. So that you, sir, right there are upset with him, he owes you money. And so I know that. So when I come into this room, I now have more leverage, more knowledge. I may use that relationship to help build a relationship between you two and then with me so that we're all together. That is, Mark won't say this, and I'm here to tell you, that's a very unusual skill that you don't usually see in the unconventional army. There's a couple things tonight. There's the conventional army like you see in Saving Private Ryan, take the beach and keep going. And then there's the unconventional army, which are the Special Forces soldiers, which grew out of the OSS in World War II. So, having said that, because we were talking earlier today, and I stopped Mark in the middle of his comments. I said, wait a minute, there were 12 of you and 600 of them? So I'm going to go sit down over there, and we're going to keep this conversation going. Right. But everyone, please, a warm round of applause for Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Doug, for those kind words. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say, I want to thank Colin Hansen for inviting Doug and I here and giving me the opportunity to come back home to the great state of Wisconsin. A kid who grew up in Milwaukee, sneaking into Brewers games, living, right next to County Stadium, and remember when the Packers used to play half their home games there. So it's great to be back here in the great state of Wisconsin, where my heart will always be. I also want to say thanks to our veterans and your families. I'm proud to be part of that group of people who were willing to put on a uniform and take the risk to serve our country and our fellow citizens, and I'm deeply grateful to all of you for that. And also I want to thank Doug for his persistence in hunting me down when he was writing this book. I think it was General Mulholland who called me and said, Mark, will you please talk to Doug? Because I'm just not very big on being in the spotlight. We call ourselves the quiet professionals, and we just, most Special Forces guys just want to be able to go and do their job and not look for the spotlight. We're not the Navy SEALs,
He said that.
I can say that. I have lots of great friends in the SEALs. And there was a funny story. I was flying into Nashville, and I was coming back from a speaking engagement. I was a senior mentor for the Navy SEALs pre-command course as their officers were preparing to go into command. And I had also stopped in to visit my friend Mike McAbee, who was the SEAL Team 5 commander and had been my deputy commander in Iraq. And they'd given me a SEAL Team 5 shirt. And as I'm getting ready to get off the plane in Nashville, this gentleman turns around, he sees my shirt, and he goes, "Are you a Navy SEAL?" I said, "No, I'm Army Green Beret." And he goes, "Oh." Yeah, and people say, "Well, what's the difference between the Green Berets and the SEALs?" And I said, "Well, we're smarter and better looking."
Well, it does raise a point. The SEALs, so we can talk about this for a moment. How is your training different than the Navy's?
It's radically different in that the SEALs are principally a direct action force, meaning that they, to carry out raids and, underwater demolition and ambushes and things like that. We can do those things and do those things, but our training is much more focused on working with indigenous forces and cross-cultural communication. Every Green Beret has to have a second language. Mine is Arabic. And our training can take up to 2 years of, very lifelike training. And again, it's focused on being able to communicate and work with people from different countries and to advise them, to build relationships with them, and to be able to work again clandestinely behind enemy lines. And to do that, you've got to speak a little bit of the language, which Doug made an important point about the lack of a plan. And I just want to back up. Andrew and I talked briefly about this. As a young officer growing up in the 80s, going through my training at Marquette University, and then early on, the memories of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were very fresh, and the horror stories that came out of there and the failures. And nobody in the Department of Defense or anywhere in the U.S. government ever thought we would be there. I'd been in Pakistan in the 90s, and we'd gone up through the Khyber Pass to what was called the Khyber Gate, which is the border crossing between Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was a time of the Afghan Civil War between all of these different factions who, a decade later, less than a decade later, we would be allied with. And we said, thank God we're not going there. And so when 9/11 happened, there was no plan. We had no basing agreements with any of the countries in the region. We had even if we had a basing agreement, we had no agreement to launch an invasion of any of their neighbors. And so that all had to be accomplished in those first few weeks after 9/11, a flurry of both diplomatic efforts to gain access to former Soviet bases in Uzbekistan, and planning efforts to figure out how we were going to get there and what we were going to do. And there was an attitude in the Pentagon and somewhat down in Tampa at the Central Command headquarters where General Franks was that, well, we're going to plan a big invasion, but it's going to take us 6 to 9 months. So we'll go ahead and send the Special Forces guys in there to get something done now, to show some progress, and they can kind of do their thing until we're ready to invade. And they were stunned, and just couldn't believe it that we accomplished in 6 weeks with a couple hundred people what they were planning to do in a year with 60 to 70,000 at least. And so it was a real...
Let's talk about that for a moment. So in a nutshell, how are those two wars different? With the troop of 60,000 and the group of...
So the first one, the conventional army would have relied strictly on U.S. Military combat, what we call combat power. All the fighting would have been done by Americans. And it's eventually where we got to in Afghanistan. We can talk about that. Our method of doing this is to leverage and support local forces to overthrow the government, the Taliban in this case. And that was our mission. They said, overthrow the Taliban and hunt down those responsible for 9/11. And the way we go about that is by advising them, providing them weapons and ammunition and air support and intelligence, and helping them organize and synchronize their efforts, but they're doing the fighting as opposed to us doing all the fighting.
There's an interesting story, Mark. You probably were there, where there'll be a slide coming up of a gentleman named General Dostum, And he is a wily character, and he has Mark and crew with him, and they're about to ride through a village, and he wants to hoist the American flag on the vehicle, and these guys rightly say, no, don't do that. Now that, in the audience, it may seem counterintuitive to all of us, but go ahead and talk about that moment and why that was done.
Because this is their fight. We're just there to support them and help them, and we want Afghans to liberate Afghanistan and to be the face and the, of that effort, and not us as foreigners coming in to do it. We're honored, privileged to participate in it, but this was their fight, and I think it's important. I would just kind of tell a story from Iraq in 2010, and I had told all my subordinate commanders that no American will ever be the first person through the door on any objective, because at this point we'd been in Iraq for 7 years. There is a sovereign government. We have Iraqi military and police forces that we're advising, and it's their country. And I said, if something happens on an objective and an American shoots somebody, it's by definition an international incident. I said, but if an Iraqi shoots another Iraqi, an Iraqi police officer, Iraqi soldier, it's an internal issue for them. And unfortunately, I had one of my SEAL teams disobey that order and kill the brother of a provincial council member. And it caused me, a tremendous amount of consternation and frustration and tremendous friction with the Iraqis. And it was, again, we're there to support them in their efforts to liberate and secure their country. We're not going there to conquer or to subdue them. And the less that we can do and the more that we can enable them, the better.
That brings us to the point of our objective in Afghanistan. Was it to create another version of America in 2001?
No. And what I've said to people, particularly in the aftermath of our withdrawal, is the original sin that we had in Afghanistan was the 2001 Bonn Agreement, where a bunch of European and American governments got together and decided to try and create a strong central government in Afghanistan. And that ended up with the inauguration of Hamid Karzai, and it set us down a path that was ill-suited for Afghanistan. The people there are, it's a really diverse, ethnically, religiously, culturally, linguistically diverse country, and a strong central government was just not what they needed. And that's why Hamid Karzai became, who was the president of Afghanistan, was ridiculed, especially by the Taliban, as the mayor of Kabul, because that was about as far as the writ of his authority went.
I know there are more points here, but what would a government look like if not for centralized?
It would be a regional federation with, because there is a general ethnic kind of and linguistic territories with the southern Afghanistan and particularly southwest or southeast Afghanistan, highly Pashtun, and they have the Hazara population in the middle. They're descendants of the Mongol invasions, and they're different because they're Shiite Muslims, and they suffered tremendously under the Taliban and Sunni Islam. And then you've got the Tajiks in the Panjshir Valley and in northeast Afghanistan. And then you've got the Uzbeks in northern and northwestern Afghanistan. So there was a basis for regional governments that were generally, but not solely, ethnically oriented. And I think that would have been a better option. The other thing that we did is there was a strong push to make sure that men like General Dostum, who was considered a warlord, had no role in the government. But Afghanistan was a country that had been at war for decades, and there was no saints left in Afghanistan when it came to this in the leadership, and so instead of just taking a realistic approach, we tried to do the strong central government, and that also fostered tremendous corruption because we were funneling all these billions of dollars through this central government, and it's getting siphoned off, and it's not getting to the people that it's supposed to get to. So,
What were the other two original sins? There was the Bonn Agreement.
So it was the Bonn Agreement. The second one was the failure to hold Pakistan accountable for its perfidy. The Pakistani ISI, their intelligence service, supported the Taliban, provided a base of operations and a safe haven for them. And it's, without getting into, we could spend hours talking about Pakistani perspectives on India, but the bottom line is they don't want to be, quote unquote, encircled by India. And so Pakistan has this desire to maintain a weak and fractious Afghanistan to prevent the Indians from developing a good relationship with a stable Afghanistan. And so that was our second sin. The third sin was that we never negotiated in earnest with the Taliban for a political solution. And much like Vietnam, Afghanistan is an internal conflict, and it's never going to end on the battlefield. You cannot kill enough people, and you don't want to kill enough people. There's some people that need to be killed, but by and large, it only ends when there is a sustainable political settlement. And politics, the art of the possible, it means you have to make some compromises. And our efforts in negotiation were basically, Taliban, we won, you lost. So tell us what concessions you're going to make to get back into Afghanistan. Instead of an earnest effort in saying, okay, what's it going to take to get a peaceful Afghanistan, which, again, was our original effort. Hunt down those responsible for 9/11, overthrow the Taliban, and hunt down those responsible for 9/11, and then make sure that it doesn't come back. And I wrote a paper in 2009 arguing that we should have offered the Taliban their own emirate carved out of Afghanistan. The southeastern provinces, with the agreements that predicated on a couple of ironclad agreements. First of all, that they agree to cease fighting and issue a fatwa telling all the Taliban to stop attacking both U.S. forces and Afghan forces. Secondly, that they agree to not host al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization. And then three, that they allow people to leave and they don't attack their neighbors. And with that, if we had offered them international recognition, I think they would have taken it, and we would be in a much different place today than we are now, because it would have changed the entire character of the conflict. So instead of being just an internal conflict, it would have changed it to an international conflict. It also would have forced the Pakistanis to make a really tough decision. Do they want an independent Taliban state on their border, or do they just want to keep the Taliban as a destabilizing influence? And I would have put them in between a rock and a hard place. But I had so many people, the White House and the Pentagon go, why would we do that? What, we won, they lost. And I think that kind of hubris came back to haunt us in the end. And I really, I got to say this, I chafe. And I know my Vietnam brothers probably feel the same way when people say, the military lost the war. And I will just tell you that there's nothing could be further from the truth. We as soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, these young men and women that we sent out there, they did everything that we asked them to do. And successive administrations failed them. And I would say they did it with valor and courage and dignity and honor. Sure, there's a couple jackasses in every bunch, but the vast majority served with honor. And we had successive administrations that failed to find a political solution to take advantage of the military gains that we had made and to really have a good political outcome.
This is so interesting, Mark, because I think I see people nodding in the audience. And we haven't really had this discussion before because 20 years later, we're in such a different place in that country.
Absolutely.
And it's all been about winning and you losing. And what's interesting about having you here is to talk about those early days. Is this kind of war fighting possible in the future again? I mean,
well,
how much of an anomaly was this moment in our American history?
I think it was a tremendous anomaly. Sadly, and this has, I think, great bearing on our future here, particularly on our conflict, our competition now with China. But the only other time in our history that we had done something similar to this was, again, the OSS parachuting. They had some in Asia, and then behind enemy lines into Europe prior to the Normandy invasion, and working with the French resistance and blowing up rail lines and preventing German reinforcement. But again, this was in the milieu of World War II, a global conflict, world war, where we were willing to take those risks. And it wasn't, honestly, in the 90s when we talked about doing this, there were people going, we're never going to do that crap. We're not going to do it. And to a large degree, they were right, because absent the trauma and the crisis of 9/11, I don't think we would have done this. And I feel like the challenge is, we were lucky in that some of our CIA colleagues had relationships with some of these guys, like General Dostum. But unconventional warfare is not something you just go, okay, we're going to do it. It takes time to study the environment, the politics, local politics, to know who the players are and to learn the languages and to think about ways you can support them and to build those clandestine relationships that allow you to do that. In this case, we benefited from the CIA's clandestine relationships with them. But there's this, what I call the paradox of unconventional warfare. Absent a crisis, none of the senior leaders in the White House, in the State Department, in the Pentagon, and Langley want to take what they see as an inordinate risk. You're going to get us into a war. And when we're talking about just, again, very low-level clandestine preparation, what we call preparation of the battlefield and preparation of the environment. But by the time there's a crisis, it's too late to turn that on. We were very lucky here that we were able to do this, again, because of those CIA relationships. But the need isn't going to go away, and in fact, I think it's greater now than ever as we think of ways to reduce China's influence and leverage around the world and to thwart their strategy. And I'll tell you, I'm terrified.
What is their strategy, and how does the unconventional model perhaps address the Chinese strategy?
Sure.
Jim?
So their strategy right now is a global strategy to gain. They have been building economic power that has now facilitated a military expansion, the likes of which this globe has not seen since the U.S. effort in World War II. It takes us 10 years to build a battleship or to build a aircraft carrier. They're building them in 18 months, and they're turning out, naval forces, and they're, in 5 years they're gonna have a 500% increase in their nuclear forces. And what they're doing is building up their military power. They're building relationships, both economic and diplomatic, and to a lesser degree military, around the world. And what I think is going to happen is that they are going to eventually invade Taiwan. They'll claim that some Taiwanese asked them to come in and do it. They will be in a position to both box out most of the U.S. Navy. They'll be in the Panama Canal. They'll shut that down. They'll shut down the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. They have a base in the Arctic that they've rented from the Russians. They'll prevent us from reinforcing, and it will become a fait accompli. And then they'll say, hey, America, you don't really want to go to war over Taiwan, do you? And at that point, the global scales, and global balance of power will have tipped, and we will be in a much different world. We said 9/11 was a failure of the imagination because we couldn't imagine the terrorists doing that. If you cannot imagine right now what a world dominated by the Chinese Communist Party looks like, where the Chinese currency has become the reserve currency, and the Chinese are now putting sanctions on American companies if they say anything or don't agree to cooperate with the Chinese. We're already seeing it. Look at the NBA. LeBron James has criticized the United States of America, but he won't say a word about the Chinese Communist Party. And so it's already happening. And that world will be much different. And if we had our act together, we would now be looking at ways to thwart their strategy without having to resort to violence, but rebuilding some relationships, and frankly, helping to undermine their working to undermine their relationships, and making sure that the vision of Xi Jinping is never realized.
But not using what you would call kinetic force.
That's right. It doesn't, and if we get to that point, I think we've kind of failed. Sun Tzu, the acme of strategy is to defeat your enemy without firing a shot. And you have to know what their strategy is, and defeat their strategy, not work to simply defeat them on the battlefield. It's important for us to have capabilities to do that, but I don't think we're in any position right now to go, the China under the Communist Party of China is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had nowhere near the economic power that the Chinese have, and it's a much different situation. And again, they're building their military might at such an incredible rate that we can't afford to keep up with it. And so I think we have to find other ways to ensure that they do not achieve their vision, because I don't want my children and my grandchildren to live in a world that's ruled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Interesting. Have you guys heard this before? I do want to get to that picture that's up above us here, but you just said something interesting, and I need you to fill in the gap,
Sure.
maybe for all this. Given the fact that they're building a huge physical force, how do you defeat the strategy? I mean, in a word,
You undermine the Communist Party. So the Communist Party of China is a small portion of the overall Chinese population. They have built their domestic political power by fomenting a Han Chinese nationalism. And I've said this, and some people think I'm nuts, but I'll say it. They're very much like the National Socialist Party of Germany, the Nazis. They're not, virulent anti-Semites, but what they're doing to the Uyghurs, the Muslim population in northwest China, these camps, they're not doing large-scale extermination, but boy, they are trying to. I think it's very close to genocide, and it's stunning. If you haven't seen some of these videos of these camps, and again, we say, well, we don't. In discussions I had as a senior leader in the Pentagon, in the White House, people say we can't do that. We can't undermine them. The other thing we need to do is stop them from stealing all our intellectual property here, and it's not just semiconductors and high tech. It's our agricultural technology too that they're stealing, and our medical technology. But I think we do need to remind the people of China that we're not their enemy, and that the Communist Party is, and undermine their grip on control so that they cannot focus externally, and that they don't have the, one of the reasons why they've created the Great Firewall of China and why they've created this surveillance state is because they do fear that domestic opposition. The Tiananmen Square massacre changed their perspective, and they are instituting. They've been on this, for 30 years now, creating a massive control apparatus to control that society because they don't want to face a threat like that, because they realize what it could mean to them. And Tiananmen scared them to the point where you can't even mention it now without the risk of disappearing. And look what they've done in Hong Kong. It's now become just another surveillance state. So anyway, kind of far off Afghanistan.
Well, maybe, but these are the kinds of discussions that soldiers have,
Yes.
leaders have,
Yeah.
which a lot of our audience and a lot of viewers don't realize. The intellectual freight that can go into war fighting. It was fascinating for me when I was writing the book to learn some of these things. We are far off from Afghanistan. I mean, I think the mission in Afghanistan, in a nutshell, was what you just said with China. But if we were to jump ahead, Mark and your team, you're going to be parachuted into Beijing, live behind enemy lines, foment revolution among the indigenous people living there, and they're going to overthrow the Communist Party. That's essentially...
Yeah, but that'd be like starting in Kabul. We're going to start out in the hinterland and work our way
Right.
towards Beijing.
Yeah. But
it also
it's
starts
tech today. Most of it's going to be done by tech and messaging.
It is. It's going to be building indigenous resistance capability. People who have a motivation and a reason to want to overthrow the Communist Party, and organizing them and helping them overthrow the Communist Party.
Right.
Yeah, but that's what we would do in an unconventional warfare
Right.
scenario.
The flip side, of course, is you attack,
Right.
which is Armageddon.
Right. You try and, a land invasion of China is just
So,
out of the question, especially now.
yeah, that's the future. Let's look at some of these slides to look at the past. Let's get to the moment, which was a pinnacle moment in, 20 years ago yesterday, Mark and his colleagues, and I say colleagues, that is the other teams that were there and from other services as well, entered into Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan and captured that city, which was strategically important.
And it was the first city liberated from the Taliban in that conflict, and it was strategic. It's the largest city in northern Afghanistan, and it was also, again, strategically located close to Uzbekistan and allow us to get there. So I fast forwarded through some of the photos that we, just to back up just a bit, we went in via MH-47 Chinook helicopters, so special operations versions of the twin rotor, about a 3.5-hour flight, and that included aerial refueling. So they have a probe that they extend on the front of the helicopter, and they pull up behind a C-130, a turboprop, 4-engine turboprop aircraft that is slowed down to just above stall speed. And that helicopter has sped up as fast as it will go, and it hits a probe and takes on fuel. They've got a basket dragging behind on a fuel line dragging behind the C-130. And this is all being done at night under, this is the picture of the MH-47 there in Karshikhanabad. And you can see the probe extending in the front there. But all done at night, zero illumination, so no moonlight, and with the pilots wearing night vision goggles. And what that looks like is, let me see if I can, did I lose control here, Colin? There you go. That's what it looks like in night vision goggles, and actually you can see in this photo that the helicopter is refueling. You may be able to make out the probe there on the left side of the photo, or the basket. And, that's what they're doing, because it is such a long flight. And
What's the altitude at times?
At this point, we're like below 1,000 feet. We're like at 500 feet. Very, low level, stay below radar. And yeah, so it's high adventure. Those pilots are really amazing, and skilled, the best in the world. So we did the infill, landed there in Afghanistan where we never thought we would be. Woke up that morning, and it was like, to my sergeant major, it's like, is this really happening? And we just couldn't quite believe it. But it very rapidly, it turned into this, the situation began to resemble our capstone training exercise for our Special Forces qualification course. It's called Robin Sage, and we spent a couple weeks in invading, going behind enemy lines in a fictional country and helping them overthrow a tyrannical regime. And I really have to hand it to all of our predecessors in the Special Forces community that built that course, because we're like, wow, this is just like Robin Sage. It was so similar that it almost felt like a training exercise, except that we knew that we're deep in the heart of Afghanistan and we may never come back.
Right, because there are no other people there. I mean, that's it.
It's just in our CIA team.
Yeah, let's talk.
With.
Yeah, because I don't want to gloss over them either. The intelligence officers, they were so important because they had kept all these networks open during the 80s and 90s, post-Soviet withdrawal.
Well, and the other thing, the most important thing, some of you may have heard, we have this saying that amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. When we talk, because your logistics, your support, where you get your food, your bullets, is really critical, because you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if you don't have the logistics, it doesn't, you're not going to be able to implement it. But as I got more senior, working in the White House and working at the Pentagon, came to realize that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk authorities. And what I mean there is both legal authorities, what we can do under United States and international law, and fiscal authorities, what we can spend money on. And those are huge constraints. And one of the constraints we had was that even though DoD theoretically had the authority to conduct unconventional warfare, we did not have the fiscal authorities to buy the arms and ammunition that we would need to provide to these resistance forces. And when we go through training, we have this code book, and in it there's all these codes for a box of AK-47s and a pallet of RPGs. And it wasn't until we went to Afghanistan that I realized it was all BS. None of that stuff existed, at least not in DoD, but the CIA had it. And because they had the authority to buy those weapons and to provide them and to give the Afghans that stuff. So it was, but of course, they didn't have fighter jets and laser designators and GPS bombs. So us working with the CIA was, two great taste great together, peanut butter and chocolate. And we worked really well together and able to overcome each other's weaknesses. But the CIA had those relationships, and they had authorities to do things that we did not have the authority to do, particularly buy weapons and ammunition and give it to foreign forces.
I just want to pause for a moment. I know Colin, I saw earlier today wearing a North Face black jacket that we all are familiar with now. You know what I'm talking about? It's ubiquitous. I don't know if your team did this, but the teams I interviewed, September 11th happens. By 2 weeks later, these guys know they're going to go overseas into Afghanistan secretly. Just 2 teams of 12, and Mark's group as well. They go to Walmart, they go to camping stores, they go to Gander Mountain, and they buy often their own equipment, their flashlights, their fleeces,
yes,
sleeping bags. This is how.
Because because before the war, before 9/11, the Army was much different. It was very stingy. We remember we had the Reagan buildup in the 80s, and when I came into the Army, it was almost 800,000 people. 1987 when I got commissioned, and then we had the first Gulf War, and then we had the peace dividend and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and by the by the time that the late 90s had come around, our special forces, we have 6 12-man detachments in a special forces company. And they're called Operational Detachment A, otherwise known as the A-Team. And that's where the TV show came from. They were a special forces A-Team that had served together in Vietnam in the plot. And we were down to 4 teams per company. And we didn't have a full complement. And we didn't have all the equipment we needed, particularly to operate in the mountains of Afghanistan behind enemy lines. So yes, they gave them the credit card, and 10 years later, when I was the group commander, our inspector general made us go through all that, and they were asking me where the receipts were for these things. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And it turned out that the commanding general at Special Forces Command now was General Mulholland, who had been our group commander, and he called me in on one day I was at Fort Bragg. And he's like, "Mark, you really got to fix this stuff, and what do you do? Why isn't this getting done?" I said, "Well, sir, some of my predecessors left me kind of a big, including him, a very big pile of stuff to clean up." And so it was it was an environment where we just didn't have that. So yes, we did buy that. Although you'll notice in this picture, this is one of the caves that we lived in. We're all in uniform because we didn't have time. I didn't have time. We had to go shopping for that stuff, and it was supposed to get to us, but it never did. And even little things, again, back to the logistics and the authorities, the saddles that we rode on, the horses that we rode on, the saddles were made of wood with oriental rug tacked onto them. Very painful. And you spend 10 hours in a wooden saddle, you'll never forget it. And we had asked ODA 595, which was on the ground about 10 days before us, asked to buy real saddles. And a couple of those guys on the team, Mark Nucci in particular, the team leader, knew their horses and knew what kind of saddles. And the request, so they send the request up, and the first thing that comes back is, what do you need saddles for? And it's like, just get us the damn saddles. And they're like, well, we don't have the authority to buy them. And they had to go through this big, bureaucratic process. And by the time we got the saddles, we didn't need them anymore because we had switched to trucks. We had gotten to Missouri Sharif, and it's crazy.
It brings us to the point, the book is called Horse Soldiers, and we haven't, the horse in the room is, why were they riding horses? And I'm going to give my 30-second take on it. What I understood is that, remember I said at the top of my remarks, the U.S. is actually the underdog in this fight. They're facing a much larger force that has Toyota trucks. They even have their own jets. They've got tanks, and we're living in caves. But we've aligned ourselves with everybody in the room here. We're all on horseback because we've been fighting the Taliban for 6 years. And what I found fascinating, because I went to Afghanistan twice and tried to interview somebody from every element, like the Air Force, the Army, and to put the whole story together was that General Dostum and his crew, for instance, would take ground by charging across the plain and overwhelming a Taliban force which was emplaced with hard armor. And there's a larger point to this, which is kind of philosophical, which was that at some point, the mechanized weapon could not respond quickly enough to the human action, and it failed. And so the horsemen would overtake the Taliban line and kill people, but the armor would retreat, turn around, and then blow them back off the ground that they had just taken. And so then you'd get back on your horse and retreat back up the mountain where the Toyota truck or the tank couldn't follow you. The secret sauce here, and Mark can talk about his people on the team, is that moment that the horses charge over the line and it starts to retreat, these bombs started dropping.
Yeah. So, one of the things that we brought was the ability to bring in U.S. air power and
You think that was the
with
biggest
precision.
thing? Like the big game changer? The air?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because it shocked the Taliban. They had no idea. And General Dostum, Afghanistan is very interesting in that there's a lot of switching sides, and what I would call perfidy. But one day somebody's working with the Taliban, and the next day they've joined the Northern Alliance. And so General Dostum, though, they had these radios, and they would talk. They knew that they could talk to the Taliban commanders, and Dostum would say, "Okay, look, either you give up and join us, or I'm going to drop bombs on you." And they'd be, "Oh, yeah." And he's like, "Okay, 5 minutes, I'm going to blow this up." And then, bam, hits right where he said it was. And they're like, "Oh, and then he goes, "What about now? How do you like me now?" And I'm going to blow up another one. And bam. And it just, the precision, they had no answer to it. and the firepower. I mean, we're dropping 2,000-pound, GPS-guided bombs, and they have, I explained earlier, what's called a CEP, circular error probable. That means of about 500 meters, and it means that 50% of everybody within 500 meters of that blast will be killed or wounded. And so it's a pretty, 500 meters is a long way. And it's a very powerful bomb. And now, all of a sudden, we're dropping it with precision on their tanks and on their headquarters. And it's being followed up by these, in conjunction with these cavalry charges. And the Taliban just didn't know what hit them.
Yeah, and that is what rolled them further and further north. The philosophical point is what's happening here in this moment, if you think about it. One side is finally, for the first time, be able to continue to act before the other side can react.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the question of, this is a very modern war in that. It's not tech-oriented, but this is how we think of in the tech world. We're changing so quickly that we gain advantage by me acting more quickly than you can react.
Right. It's what we call what one Air Force theorist called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And we seek to operate inside their OODA loop faster than they can complete it and figure out what we're doing. We're inside their loop. And so before they even have a chance to decide what to do next, there's something else coming at them. And it's like, it's just, it just kept them reeling. It was like somebody who just couldn't see, it's like a boxing match with a flash. He's punching faster than you can see, and you're just getting knocked backwards and backwards and backwards. And that was exactly what happened.
So that brings us to, let's say January of '02.
Okay?
We've won.
Yeah.
Have we?
Well,
Let's talk about that definition of success.
Yeah, victory and winning is a very difficult concept to define in this type of conflict. Again, because typically when we determine what we consider victory, in World War II in particular, is that the enemy has lost their will to fight. And we saw that, but in World War II, it took firebombing of German cities and leveling most of Germany. It took nuclear weapons in Japan to break their will to fight. And in a conflict like this, again, as I think I said earlier, you just can't kill that many people. It's not you're not going to get that total victory on the battlefield. And so you have to look for other ways to break their will. And we had broken it at that point because they had fled to Pakistan. And this was a mistake, assuming that they wouldn't come back and that we had kind of broken their will permanently. But that just wasn't the case. And they were given enough time, they regained their will to fight. They were rearmed by the Pakistanis, reorganized, and began, fighting again.
Doing my interviews, Mark, certain people, senior, would say, if we'd left in 2002 or 2003, we might have ended up where we are today, 20 years later anyway. In fact, we might have been ahead. How do you respond to a comment like that?
It's just, I would certainly say I don't think we'd, mean the Taliban might have taken over sooner again, or?
Well, we wouldn't have lost or spent so much blood and treasure. That'd be one thing. But they have retaken Kabul and are nominally,
right.
Ostensibly in charge. So
I would say that there's, it's a little bit myopic because our efforts there, regardless of what happened this year, did allow us to prevent another 9/11. We decimated Al-Qaeda, a generation plus of Al-Qaeda, and set them back, at least in their ability in Afghanistan, and along with other changes that we made. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't had another 9/11 type attack. I think we did make a mistake, again, by not holding Pakistan accountable and then taking on so much of the fighting on our own. And that was difficult, rather than letting and again, we tried to create an Afghan army that was very much a mirror image of ours. And they don't have the resources, and all these other things that you need, the culture to create a Western style army. And I think that was a mistake. And again, we took on too much of the fighting, and probably I think would have been successful if we had let some of General Dostum and some of these militias, with some oversight, keep the Taliban in check.
Yeah, I mean, so our moral question is, are we going to be in business with a nominal warlord enterprise in order to keep the peace? And that's
there's no I would say there's no easy answer to
Right.
that question, because we want to promote human rights, and we did. One of the things that we do as special forces is, the scenarios that we go through in training, and we witness, summary executions, and we have to react to it. And how do you deal with that? And it's not there's no simple answer. The other scenario that we do in training is, you get compromised by a young goat herd, and what do you do with that young child? And this was exactly the scenario that the Navy SEALs got into in the story that was made into Lone Survivor with Marcus Luttrell, is that they were in an area and they had a little kid find them. Most of us are, the special operations community is older. Most of us are parents ourselves.
yeah.
We're not going to kill a kid. I mean, it's not going to do it. But what do you do, if you tie them up and you flex cuff them? Somebody's going to notice that kid's not back, and they're going to come out looking for him. If you let them go, they're going to tell the first person that they ran into that they saw some Americans up there. And so it's kind of it's a no-win situation. You want to try and balance, maybe keeping that kid long enough where somebody will find him, but you got the time to get out of there. But there's those moral questions. And so I spoke at my high school, Marquette High, and I'm a practicing Catholic, and I had one of the young students say to me, he says, how can you as a practicing, believing Catholic, a Christian, participate in war? And I said, wow, the last thing you want is war run by a bunch of people who have no, who don't believe in God and have no moral constraints. War is terrible enough without that, and it weighs heavily on all of us. And I think that's part of the reason why people have PTSD, because killing other human beings in conflict is not natural, and there is a moral component to it, and that we all kind of bear with it. But you try and do it in a way that, again, impresses upon our counterparts the necessity of trying to fight a war in as honorable and moral a way as possible.
And it's tough. And what I want to impress upon all of us here is the degree, the complexity of the training that people like Mark go through. You see that it's just not doing push-ups.
No, running on the beach in short shorts.
I mean, I can attest, I went to Robin Sade's training as part of my research and took part in some of the scenarios. And one young captain who's green, totally young, he is compromised in a situation, and the guerrilla chief, which would be in this case the dostum he's going to meet down in his career, says, if you don't tell me how you know this, I'm going to shoot one of your men. And he cannot, the young captain cannot disclose this information. It's against the law, but yet he can't let one of his, there's no easy answer here. And the instructors are off in the bushes wearing black t-shirts, watching it, and it's happening in real time. And they're watching the young man start to kind of delaminate. They say, okay, hold it, and they pause, and they bring him out. Okay, Charlie, here you are in this moment. How did you get here? Well, he asked me where the stuff was, and I could, no. Do you remember 2 days ago when he looked at you in this certain way, and you weren't aware of that moment? And then actually the week earlier when you, quote, what they call infilled, and you came and you found this thing. The problem you're going to face, Charlie, downrange, as they say, often happen days or weeks before you're even aware of them. Yeah. And so you're being trained really almost like a Jedi Knight to become aware. Am I right?
Yeah.
To have these skills of empathy.
Well, and that cross-cultural communication and understanding, being able to put yourself in your counterpart's shoes, building a relationship based off of mutual respect and shared objectives. And to the extent that you come in as the American, all right, we're here to save you, and this is what you're going to need to do. You're going to find yourself you're going to find yourself outside the G base, the guerrilla base, very quickly, and then that's potentially mission failure. So it's a big part of our training, and it's also why again we're regionally oriented, so that we can spend lots of time studying and visiting places and working with people in these cultures and getting to know them, honing our language skills, being able to recognize cultural habits and body language. And I had a point where I was a young Special Forces Detachment Commander. I was in Kuwait, and I was working with one of my Kuwaiti counterparts, and we were supposed to go out to a place called Falika Island to train for a couple of days. And I kept asking him about the preparation. They were supposed to have food. He needed to get food for his soldiers. And I would say, is the food arrangements made? And he says, yes, inshallah, inshallah. And I wasn't paying close enough attention to it. And when we got out there, the food wasn't there. And after like a day of training, we had to come back, and we didn't complete the training. And I realized that, and then his commander came to talk to me, and his commander was embarrassed, and he was very frustrated with him because he realized that he had deliberately not done that. And I should have recognized it too, because when he was saying to me, inshallah, which it means in Arabic, God willing, basically he was telling me, I'm not going to do it, but God might, and so it didn't happen. And so after that, I began all of my future and sometimes it's just a very pious saying, but you really have to be attuned to body language, and you get that, and you can only develop that by spending time with people and getting to know them on an individual level and treating them with mutual respect.
I know that we want some questions. Is that right? We brought us forward, Mark, and I know the audience is probably wondering, okay, you've said all this. We've seen how it's worked in practice. How did we end up at August 14th, 2021 with the fall of Kabul? And what would seem to be a reversal of fortune.
Right. Well, what I would tell you is that in my humble opinion, we pulled the rug out from our Afghan counterparts. As I said earlier, we built an Afghan National Army that was very much mirror imaged on us, that had the fighting capability, but back to my earlier comment about logistics, they didn't have the logistical support. They relied on us for the logistical support, the indirect fires, the aircraft, the air support, medical evacuation and helicopters, some of our intelligence capabilities. They relied on us for that. And as long as we were there with them, sharing that, they were willing to fight, by and large. And they had the competence. We gave them the backbone. We saw the same dynamic in Iraq in 2014 when ISIS almost overtook Mosul, that a lot of the, some of the Iraqi units, without our support, collapsed. And we had a big psychological effect on that. And, again, putting yourself in their shoes, it's like, man, America's leaving us, the most powerful military in the world, and they can't beat these guys? What chance do I stand, And and some of the Afghans said, look, don't tell me I didn't fight. I've been fighting for 15 years. But you left me. And I always say this, you can't be a partner from 3,000 miles away. If you want to be a partner and you want to work with people and you have to have that shared objective and you have to share some of the risks. I just want to, I'll fast forward here real quick in one of the photos. These, we didn't get a chance to talk about these, but this is a photo of me at the Battle of Kalai Jangi. When some people notice immediately, they go, where's your helmet? Where's your body armor? We didn't have it. We didn't take it with us because our Afghan counterparts didn't have it. And we were going to share the same risks as them. And so they didn't have body armor. We didn't have body armor. They rode horses. We rode horses. We shared those risks with them. And I think what happened is when we made the decision to pull out completely, it broke them psychologically.
Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah. My fifth graders might need to get to bed if they want to do well on their math test and their assessment for reading. No. We're around 8 o'clock and stuff like that, so I would like to run around and see if there's some questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So raise your hand high and my long legs will get there.
Do you think the American military learned anything from the debacle in August? Or the political class above them?
So I want to give you some insights about part of the reason why it was a debacle. And I know this because of my experience both in the White House and the Pentagon. There were senior leaders in the Pentagon, and I think maybe even at the White House, who thought, we convinced President Obama to stay, we convinced President Trump to stay, we'll convince President Biden to stay. And as a consequence, and they drug their feet and hoping to say, well, it's going to take us 6 months, and they give him more time to work on him. And when the president said, hey, get out, what don't you understand? Get out. They were unprepared, and the debacle of the withdrawal, I don't know if they learned any lessons. I hope they do, but I will just say I'm glad I'm not serving in today's Army, in today's DOD, because I don't think their focus is on the right things, and I'm not sure they learned a lot of lessons. I did have the opportunity, the 82nd Airborne Commander on the ground, Major General Chris Donahue, you may see in the papers, he was the last man out of Afghanistan, is a friend of mine for many years, was in town a few weeks ago, and in Washington, D.C. for the Association of the U.S. Army convention. I did have a chance to have a couple adult beverages with him, And I think, he's a very, he was a former Delta Force commander and, is a great soldier, great American. I think he felt very hamstrung, was given a kind of a crappy sandwich to eat and did the best that he could. But I don't have confidence right now that they learned any big lessons from it.
I have two questions. One is, what is your prognosis on how these tribal people will respond after the shock of the U.S. withdrawal? If they'll eventually be able to overtake the Taliban again? And my second question is, do you have any opinion on the portrayal of your actions from the movie, about the movie?
All right. Well, so I'll take the easy one first, as I haven't seen the movie, and my character was written out of the script. I mean, there's probably, yeah, not by Doug. I tell people, Jerry Bruckheimer is an action movie director, and the movie is an action movie. It's not a documentary. My mother was really angry that I wasn't in the movie.
Oh man, I feel terrible now. I've met his mom. That's horrible.
And I said, Mom, I've already had my 15 minutes of fame. It's all right.
But pause. By that he means he's on the front page of the New York Times on November 26th or 27th of 2001, staring into Kalenjin Fortress. Look at that photo up here behind us, for which he's awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award, for taking 12 soldiers.
Yeah.
And fighting
Air
off
Force guys.
and fighting off a force of very committed 600 fighters who are trying to break out of that fortress in a reverse Alamo kind of thing. That's what he means by his really important contribution to our security. I just want to say about the movie, what I will say about it is that it didn't become a Rambo movie or a Navy SEAL movie.
Yeah.
It was a fraught question because this book and what we've talked about, we've set up here and we've really been talking about talking. Like talking with each other, understanding. That's a hard movie to make as a war movie. That's not what we normally think of as a war movie.
Right.
But yet this was a war. And so I will hand it to Bruckheimer and company that they did not make it into, a SEAL movie. And there's a lot of talking in it. And there is a lot of shoot 'em up towards the end to kind of catch up for the talking. But the reason he's not in it, and that action, that valorous action at Kalenjin, is that they didn't film it. They filmed half the book. They filmed the capture of the city, and then that action happened after the capture. And so the movie ended on a high point. Thus, Mark's not there,
Doug,
but yes.
Earlier in your presentation, you referenced activities by China, and you talked about they're able to build an aircraft carrier in 18 months, where it takes us 10 years. That was just an anecdotal example on your part, but you seem to, and then of course there's soft diplomacy around the world, and you seem to left us hanging there in terms of the United States wasn't doing anything to counter this. That was sort of the impression. I mean, at least I got that. Where I can't believe that we're not out there doing something similar, at least by our own design.
We are doing some things, but I don't think we're doing enough, and we're not doing it in a consistent and coherent manner. One of the challenges we face in a democratic society is we change government fairly often. I mean, at least every 8 years, we've got a new president. And, Xi Jinping has been in power now for, a decade plus, and he's got plans to stay in power. And it gives him some strategic consistency. And we kind of go back and forth. And that hamstrings us a little bit. We do have, I think, tremendously more attractive cultural and informational power And just real quickly, spoken to African officers, officers from different countries in Africa that have come to the United States to train, and they have also gone to China to train. And they come back and they're just, first of all, some people say the United States is racist, but you have no idea how racist the Chinese are and how they treat these Africans. And they come back so frustrated, and their experience is so much different than when they come here and train with us and attend our schools, because there they were isolated and segregated. Here, when we have these officers come, they're in our classes with us. They're our partners, and I think that's a tremendous power. But we, as a government, not as a nation, but as a government, we rarely harness that strategically, and we just kind of let it happen organically, and it doesn't always happen as effectively. So we are doing some things. I think there is compared to where we were even 5 years ago, there's a much greater awareness of the threat and their strategy, but I just don't feel that we have a coherent national strategy that we can execute over a couple decades. We didn't have that quite that much we had some changes in the Cold War, but we had a strategic consensus between the parties about the threat from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And let me just go back real quick, because I didn't answer your other question about will the tribes in Afghanistan rise up? I know that there are lots of Afghans that are struggling and resisting the Taliban. There have been some armed clashes, but it's going to take them a while to rebuild their capacity and get there. But I think they eventually will.
That's a hot mic. To your subtle theory that China's kind of subtle takeover. You mentioned strategically maybe an invasion of Thailand, and then also economically with tariffs on our agricultural products and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Could you speak to also the media and how they've or maybe they will also try and push their agenda through other mediums, and then how we as obviously a younger person can try and combat and maybe oppose something like that.
Sure. Well, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese have bought AMC theaters, and they're putting restrictions on movies and stuff. So you need to be. I think the first key is to be aware of what they're doing, and what we're starting to find out too is that the Chinese have done a lot of work under the guise of cultural exchanges, and they've really, I think they've bought a lot of academics, and to a lesser extent, they've bought some media personalities. And there's some really good books out there there was the Claws of the Panda. I think there was one about Australia and Chinese influence in Australia and Chinese influence in Canada. And how they've gone about it. And I'd recommend those books to you. I'd also recommend reading The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury, and looking at the Epoch Times. It's written by a bunch of Chinese expats who are now American citizens, and they are very anti-CCP. And they put a spotlight on all these efforts. And I think being aware of what's going on is the first step in being able to counter it and inoculate yourself.
So I'm still puzzled on this whole horse soldiers idea, that you can take a bunch of guys that I assume are not horsemen and put them in Afghanistan and ride on wooden saddles and be an effective fighting force. Can you talk? I don't understand how that happens, or were you all John Waynes before you went over there? I don't get it.
So it's funny that you bring up John Wayne. I just have to say this. So in the movie, The Green Berets, John Wayne played the 5th Special Forces Group Commander. Mike, his name was Mike Kirby, and that was the same job that I held from 2009 to 2011. I was the 5th Special Forces Group Commander. So I tell people, I was John Wayne, 50 years later. First of all, you got to remember the horses. We as Americans didn't do a bunch of fighting from the horses. They were a means of transport on the battlefield for us to get around and means of mobility. Some of us had been on horseback before. A couple of guys had never been on horseback before, and it was high adventure. Learning on the fly, but we have to be, it's part of our selection process. We go through a rigorous assessment and selection, and when I went to Special Forces Assessment and Selection, started out with over 400 people in the class. Out of that, they took about 100 people at the end. So that was the first cut. And out of that 100 people, only about 40 actually made it through all the training. And so through that rigorous assessment, selection, and training process, it's designed to select people that are highly adaptable, can think on their feet, and can figure out how to get the mission done. And I told this story earlier today. I'll tell it again because it's probably my, people say, what was your proudest accomplishment in Afghanistan? And they expect me to talk about, the Distinguished Service Cross and the battle. And I go, no, the best thing was getting the airfield open. And I got a few pictures here. I'm gonna fast forward here, past the battle and the tanks. And this was a bunch of prisoners in Sheboygan in the aftermath of the battle at Kunduz. And out of the survivors at the Battle of Kalai-Jangi, out of the 600, 85 survived, and they were taken to this prison in Sheboygan. And in and amongst them was this guy. And I asked the kids this morning. I said, "Do you guys know who this is?" And one kid said, "Jesus." Nice. I said, "No, definitely not." This is Johnny Walker Lind, the American Taliban that we captured. This was just before he was on his way to Kandahar and then back to the United States here for trial. He recently got out of prison after serving, I think, about 18 or 19 years of a 20-year sentence back out there. But this was a bunch of school kids. The Afghan girls, as you can see from this photo, were really, really excited to be back in school. And I said to the kids at Edgar Elementary, I says, "Is this what you guys are like in the morning, coming to school?" No, definitely not. But these kids were excited. So this is a crater on the airfield in Mazar-i Sharif. And the United States Air Force has a playbook. And even though the Taliban really didn't have much of an Air Force, the United States Air Force playbook says crater the runways. So they cratered the one runway in Mazar-i Sharif with like 10 cratering charges. And there was like 5 of these massive holes down the length of the runway, and then they, like 6 at the end, or 4. And we were told, "Hey, you guys got to get that airport open." And we're like, "Okay, we got no rebar, we got no asphalt, we got no concrete, no crushed gravel, no heavy equipment. Give us a little bit, we'll figure it out." So what we ended up doing was we had one Air Force Red Horse engineer. So what they call a horizontal engineer, so a guy that knows how to build runways, but he's just one guy. But he did give us some advice and helped us, and we paid Afghans by the truckload, Toyota pickup trucks, to bring smooth river rock and to fill all these craters. And you can imagine, how many pickup truck loads of river rock it takes to fill a hole that size. And we all carried cash with us and paid them like $100 per pickup truck load. And so then we bought 55-gallon drums of tar from an Uzbek mobster named Kamgar, and he ran the black market across the Amu Darya River from Uzbekistan into Afghanistan because the main bridge at Hiratan was closed. And we had our Afghan help melt that tar over a wooden, a wood fire, and then pour it on that river rock. And one of our mechanics got a steamroller, a Russian-era steamroller working. And we'd let it cool, we'd drive the steamroller over it, put a little more river rock on it, some more tar, until we had a level surface. And this is another one of the craters. This is what I call one of our Afghan runway engineers out there doing some of the final cleanup. And we ended up bringing in over 200 aircraft onto that runway. One of our Air Force Special Ops guys is trained as an air traffic controller. He did the air traffic control, talked to the pilots, brought them in, and we brought in huge aircraft. US C-17s, Russian IL-76s, and in one case, an Iranian C-130 landed unannounced. This was, back to my earlier comments, I got to tell a story. It was very quickly. They wanted to start General Dostum and the other leaders of the Northern Alliance wanted to start a non-sectarian police force in Mazar-i-Sharif. And they asked us, can you buy us uniforms? It's going to be 600 guys, 200 from each faction. And they wanted 2 uniforms apiece. And so we sent a request up to our headquarters and said, it came back and said, no, DOD's we don't have authorization to buy these uniforms and give them to police. And so we went to the State Department. We said, hey, can you buy these? And they said, no, the nation of Afghanistan is still under sanctions, and we're not authorized to buy these uniforms for them. And then we went to the CIA, and the CIA said, no, we're only equipping paramilitary forces. And so we went back and said, to General Dostum, we don't have the authority to buy this. And the next day, the Iranian C-130 landed and gave new uniforms to all these guys. Penny wise, pound foolish. It would have cost us probably, less than $25,000. And the Department of Defense spends that money in a blink of an eye. And we lost some stature in the eyes of our Afghan allies over that. But so anyway, getting that runway open allowed us to bring in food and supplies that we distributed to the refugee camps around Mazar-i-Sharif. These people living in these squalid tents in December of 2000, in the winter. And I mean, these tents are paper thin, and these kids are starving. And we managed to bring in plane load after plane load of supplies to distribute to them. And here you see a bunch of kids running one of the camps, taking the bags of rice back to their hovels. But it forestalled a humanitarian, even greater humanitarian disaster than had already occurred there. And this last piece, very few people know this, each of the Special Forces teams that went in after 9/11 carried with it a piece of the World Trade Center. And that's what's in this bag here with a letter. And we were instructed to bury it at a location where we had inflicted defeat on the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. This was buried in Mazar-i-Sharif on January 11th, 2002. We held a ceremony and gave it a proper burial there in honor of all the victims and particularly our comrades in arms and the first responders there. Each team recorded it with a GPS and got a 10-digit grid coordinate, which comes down to about a meter square, so about 3 foot square. It was plotted by our graphic artists on this map, and full-size copies, about a 3 foot by 5 foot map, framed, were delivered to the New York Police Department, New York Fire Department, and the New York Port Authority. And when I was the 5th Group Commander, I personally presented one to the 9/11 Museum. And so, to me, it was a great honor to be part of that response to 9/11, regardless of what has happened here in the last year, and remain very proud of my service there.
As you should be. And thank you so much for sharing yourself here on the stage. And I know there's a couple more questions.
sure.
But go ahead.
A very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for coming to Wausau. Now I have two questions. Question number one, Soviets stumbled in Afghanistan very badly. And don't you think that in terms of China, all we have to do is just sit back, contain them a little bit, and wait till they will stumble? That was the first question.
Okay.
My second question, again, as I told you before presentation, I was growing up in Ukraine, the Soviet Union at that time. And I heard a lot of stories about Afghanistan, war from soldiers, but also Soviets were trying to do a little bit of nation building in their own way. Right, little known fact that they took one of the pilots to space, so it was Afghani space cosmonaut. Basically, they built the medical schools, they tried to develop that a little bit. And obviously, entrance into war was very different between the United States and Afghanistan and Soviets. So, but at some point, I think when the United States obviously didn't do too well in Afghanistan, did you pull Soviets' books or look at their experience? Or so I guess it's my second question. Did you look into Soviets' experience and try to avoid some maybe mistakes they did? That was my question.
Yeah, so the first question I'll answer about China. Yes, China, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party does have they have a very heavy hand, and they do have a tendency to alienate and make mistakes. But I don't think we should, they're very smart, very bright. They do occasionally learn from their lessons, and we should not sit back and we shouldn't count on them stumbling severely enough to prevent them from achieving their strategy. I think maybe we need to give them a little push now and then, help them stumble. And yes, we did, we had looked at the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. As the United States Army had studied it and had provided, there was books on it. There was a book called The Bear Went Over the Mountain about that. And yes, we were very well aware of what the Soviets had experienced, which was terrifying for some of us, going into Afghanistan in an unknown situation, and are they gonna turn on us, and are we gonna end up like some of the Soviet soldiers that were captured by the Mujahideen and tortured and killed? So yes, we're aware of it. I think our army is a much different army than the army of the former Soviet Union. Just in the culture and the structure and how we approach it, and the fact that we're an all-volunteer army. For better or worse, I think it's a true meritocracy, and we have lots of really great people, and we treat them very well. And I think for the most part, and especially now, after 20 years of war, we've made tremendous strides. There's always a place we can improve in, but particularly in contrast to what our Vietnam veterans experienced. I think we as a nation treated them very, very badly, and my generation was the beneficiary of much better treatment, both in terms of the capabilities that we were, the benefits that we were given, and the welcomes that we received here at home. But so we are a different army, and a lot of that is because we did study those, and we did not want to repeat. Well, at least some of us had studied it and didn't want to repeat it. I think General Franks and some of the generals would have been, if they had had their way, they probably would have repeated it if we had not succeeded. So, again, not everybody paid close attention to it.
I hate to cut it short, but a round of applause for our speakers today. And again, another round of applause for our veterans and loved ones that are in the crowd today. Again. Like was talked about and stuff like that, relationship building. And this has been a wonderful, not only day, but when you look up here and see these logos, that's a celebration of 15 years of relationship building with businesses, groups, and organizations. And, you know, why are we here? Right there. That is why we're here. It's not one person. Sometimes I get the short straw, and I have to be up here doing all these things, but it takes a village not only to raise a kid, but it takes a village to come together and provide these opportunities. So I would like to read our list of sponsors, and I would like to urge you this. Many of these businesses, groups, and organizations been here for 15 years, constantly donating money, their time, and even some of them will actually call me and say, we haven't heard from you. Are you having programs? So they'll search me out to make a donation. So I hope for a lot of these on Small Business Saturday, November 27th, you search them out and help them back to what they've given to this community. The Dudley Foundation, Berg Sales, MP&C, Toyota of Wausau, Nicolay Bank of Wausau and Edgar, Badger Basket, Covantage Credit Union, Edgar Lyons, the Edgar Legion, Hugum Law Firm, Yankee Bookstore, the Edgar School District, People's State Bank, the Edgar Area JCs, Wausau Noon Optimist, Young's Drugstore, the Edgar Sport and Spine, Rebecca Larson, Wisconsin Public Radio, Knights of Columbus, Prevail Bank, Reuter Ware, Edgar FFA, Southport Engineered Systems, in memory of Daniel J. Merkus, the Wausau School District, Cadott School District, Terry and Colleen Gerink, the Montgomery Plant Dudley Post 10, Jack and Sally Vistra, Carrie and John Lashinsky, Sue Shackle, Greenheck Fan Corporation, the Edgar PTO, Edgar VFW, Godorsey, ELM of Edgar, the Jefferson Street Inn, Scotty's, the Mint Cafe, Fenwood Lions, Samuels Group, Abbey Bank, Edgar IGA, Marathon County Public Library, Midwest Dental, BAME Insurance, Walmart, Marathon Cheese Corporation, Dale and Amy Dalkey, Cloverbelt Credit Union, CCT Controlled Concepts Technology, Wood Trust Bank, Marathon County Deputy Sheriff's Benevolent Association, Heil Harvest, the Edgar Area Education Foundation, Judd S. Alexander Foundation, Richard and Paula Barnes, NWA Northwestern Wisconsin Associates, UWSP Wausau Campus, Northern Lutheran School District, Vietnam Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans, Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, T&J Concrete, B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation. Please join me in a round of applause.
Colin, I just want to say one thing. Thank you for having us here, and thank you, Mark. And I want to say to you, I've done a lot of events around the country. I have something similar in my home state of Michigan, and I have to tell you, you have a real gem here and a real powerhouse of creativity and community engagement that's really, really impressive from where we both sit. So thank you for supporting us. I've had a wonderful time sitting up here and learning from my friend Mark. I learn something every time we meet. And so it's been a pleasure. Thank you all.
I would second that. Thank you very much, Colin.
Awesome, awesome. We do have maybe 2 more programs this year, working on some more grants and stuff like that. So keep your eyes and ears open for February, celebrating the Olympics. Got an amazing story that might be coming to town. And then in March, a historic program. And because of our programs, and I'm going to invite you guys to make some phone calls too, because of our programs, many people know of the Little Rock Nine in 1957 to desegregate public schools. But in 1956, in Clinton, Tennessee, 12 African Americans did it first and have never been recognized. Joanne Allen Boyce is one of them, and many of our younger people might know Cameron Boyce, who was a Disney Nickelodeon star who died of epilepsy. His grandmother was one of the Clinton 12. Her uncle was a Tuskegee Airman. I mean, think of the lineage of that. But there is a House resolution bill, and we're on the long road because I will help them get the Congressional Gold Medal, maybe even the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But Representative Jim Cooper's office in Tennessee said we have to start small. There is a House resolution bill, number 588, and we need to make that happen. They deserve recognition. And so please keep your eyes and ears low. There are some, I'm not a Facebook person, but there are some sheets out there. Like us on Facebook so we can help with that. Tune in to Wisconsin Public Radio for their announcements and stuff like that. But again, happy holidays. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful evening, and thanks again for everything. Good night.